Hi everyone, today a tutorial on casting off and casting on in one project. That means you are casting off in the middle of a project and then you cast on all the stitches again. Basically you can use all the ways or methods of casting off and casting off that you know and you are able to do. The easiest way is to use a cast on and or cast off that you can adjust afterwards if necessary. The first way I want to show you is the one with reinforcement on both sides. You divide your project in such a way that it's clear to you which stitches you want to cast off. You just saw that it is quite difficult to put that stitch back on the peg. So you knit a stitch now and you actually move it to your first stitch that you knit. You move it at the part that remains on the loom. That will be your extra reinforcement. Because the project is rather pulled apart on the loom, you will have some trouble moving the first stitches. You take the two knitted stitches together over the stitch and then you try to move it as far back as possible to your project. So, like here, you put both stitches over. You grab that stitch and you try to put it back to the project as far as possible. So, like you see here, there will be one peg in between at this moment. And in the beginning that's a bit tricky, but actually you do exactly the same as you would normally do with a traditional cast off. And now you see that I can put it back and that there is actually a peg in between, and that's just because of the tension of the loom. And in this video you'll see me cast off in rib stitch and from the loose wrist, but of course you can also cast off with a knit stitch. And you put it back on the peg and you see it with a peg in between, and then you knit your next stitch. And then after a few stitches you will see you can put it back next to the project. Move stitch 2 to stitch 1, you knit over and you put it back to your project. And now you see the tension is enough to cast off further, and then just continue with your way of casting off until you get to your marker, or you say, I have casted off enough stitches over here. So you knit 2 stitches, stitch 2 to stitch 1, put the bottom one over the top one and put it back to your project. And that's your first stitch from then on. And then you repeat that continuously until you are almost at your marker. So now you're almost at your marker. You cast off another stitch, bottom over the top, you move it back to your project. Here's your marker, and actually your last stitch of the casting off part of that big hole you are creating. You move it to the part that remains on the loom. So the stitches you don't really need to cast off. And here you'll have to be very careful that you keep your tension right. And you can do that by looping, correcting, adjusting, tightening the stitch a bit, and then you knit over. And actually you cast off a kind of knit together stitch and put that back. And here you see me putting one strand back instead of 2. A little mistake, but I will show you how you can undo that. You quietly grab everything, all the loops, one by one, and you put them back on the pegs. Look, you see the next stitch again, and you put it back very nice and gently. And so you put back stitch by stitch, and then you actually repeat what you wanted to do here. You need those stitches together. You adjust them so there are as few holes as possible on the side, and you cast off the stitch. And so for a yoga sock, for example, you needed the heel part. So actually you created a heel with a giant hole. In this part you can actually use any technique of casting off that you are able to do or know. Use the way of casting off that the project just needs there, and you can make that hole or gap as big or small as you want. Then you continue in pattern, no matter what stitch you use, until you reach the first empty pegs again. So there where you started with your casting off. And here I'll demonstrate how it's done without reinforcing on both sides. Actually, it's almost exactly the same as what you saw before, only you don't knit two stitches together on the sides. Try to knit as loose as possible, and here also from the loose wrist. The stitch is actually almost as big as the space in between two pegs, and during this part of casting off you use the stitch in which you knit your project. I use rib stitch here. That is why I knit a purl on the pegs where there's a marker. But also here just use the casting off that you like, and also one that fits the project. And here again make your gap or hole as big or small as you want it to be. Later on in the video I will demonstrate how you can weave in, finish this part when you don't use two stitches to reinforce the sides. And here, when you're done with your casting off part, you knit the pegs with the stitches on them until you reach the part where the empty pegs are. With a double E-wrap cast on, it's actually very simple. You're finished here, and what you're going to do is just continue with your working yarn in double E-wrap cast on. Watch the video of the double E-wrap cast on this channel to see how you can adjust this cast on the best way. You continue knitting and put on all the empty pegs another cast on stitch, and after that you can continue your project again. You can also cast on with a long tail cast on here, and the only difference here is that you are going to use an extra strand that is 3 times as long as the empty peg. You secure your working yarn and you continue casting on in long tail, and that might mean that you cast on all stitches in a knit, or that you cast on all stitches in rib, so 1 knit or 1 purl, or 2 knit or 2 purl and 2 purl. Use the kind of method that your project needs, and of course the one you like. So you're going to cast on all the empty pegs now, and when you're almost at the end, you keep an eye on your strands, on your tension. Look, Here you just cast on the last empty peg and just check your tension every time. You can tie a knot in that long strand, so you can't confuse it with your working yarn when you are again at that spot again when you knit it in the round. You cast on your stitches. I decided to do that in rib stitch. You pull at your last stitch. This is a purl stitch, so here you continue in the stitch pattern. Make sure that you put the one you had secured, you put it aside for a moment. You knit the stitch and then you put it back again. It's just to keep the tension right there when you're knitting. And you continue in pattern, and in pattern you knit the stitches you were doing before, so the stitches you were using for your project, until you reach the part you had just cast it on. Look, this is the one you had secured, and you knit the stitch. Now you can take it off, because otherwise you might accidentally knit it. That's not the intention. If your tail's end is longer, just tie a knot in it. Also useful. Suppose at some point you remove it from the loom and it loops through. Then it goes no further than that knot. And later you can adjust the tension, so I'll show you that later with the finishing of your project. Well, you continue knitting in rib stitch or in knit stitch. It's the stitch you had chosen for your project, and you knit or continue knitting till you have had all the cast on stitches, the stitches you have cast on row before. With a double E-wrap cast on, you don't really have to do this, then you can actually just continue knitting here. When you had done the long tail, then you have to take care of your tension here, and this is the last stitch of the cast on, and most of the times that would loop through. The moment it loops through, it's not doing it right now, but most of the time it does. You just adjust it and pull it very slowly, because you want to have the same tension over here, and you continue in pattern. Well, okay, after making your project, you start to weave in ends, especially when you have used a long tail or the rib stitch cast on. You're going to weave them in on both sides. You look closely at your project. This is the spot where I knitted those two stitches together, so you can see that it gives an extra reinforcement. Possibly when you see that you haven't had your tension right here, you can still adjust them by following the V shapes and the ribs, and then you pull at it a little bit. And because I've knit together over here, that's a bit more difficult. But if you follow the stitch closely, look here, you can make the stitch a little bit smaller, so there's less of a hole to be spotted. And if you pull at it very quiet and gently, you'll see it move here, and then you pull it through. That applies to the other ones as well, and you keep on doing that until you see that it neatly merges into the project or fabric. So follow the V shapes and the ribs and adjust it where it needs to be adjusted. So you can weave them in, but you can also say, I use it for extra reinforcement. This is your cast off edge, and this is your cast on edge. You could even use these tails ends to make the hole smaller. You just take a good look at what the project needs. Look here, you actually see a kind of hole, so it's better to let it merge into your project. You can do that by looking for a stitch that has some solidity, then you put it in, and then you go back to where the strand came out when you started, so in the middle of a V shape of the cast on edge. So this is where the strand came out, back in again. So actually you create a new V shape on top, and then you make a kind of overflow. You adjust it so that it actually flows or merge into each other. You check again if it needs some extras, possibly you can even join them. You see that later. When I weave in, I always move one stitch down, but you can also use your own way or method of weaving ends. There are also people who don't use knots at all. You can also divide those strands over here, so that you first finish one strand and then the other. The bump will be a little bit less there, and you weave them in, and then you cut off the yarn. Ditto for the other side. You check if it needs something extra, reinforcement or adjusting, so there are no holes or gaps over here. And with the long tail you have a tail's end over here. When you don't have a tail's end, you weave one in, you make a knot, and then you weave it in on the other side of the gap. There are more techniques to do this. Here too, you have a look. Does it need some more? And I think I'm going to copy this stitch just one more time. Then it will get that extra solidity. And then you just look at what is most beautiful. Actually, on the top of this, you just make another V shape, and you look again. You can always mend by pulling out the working yarn. So if you don't want it over there, just pull it out. Look at what your project needs at that moment. Okay, this is the good side, so this is the wrong, and adjust it to the tension or elasticity of the project. And you weave in one stitch down, and when it pops out there, I always go behind that loop and weave it in. Make a knot, and either you follow the V shapes or the ribs, it doesn't matter, and then you cut the yarn. So take a good look at what your project needs there, and also at the double E-wrap cast on. Then you look at what your project needs, and sometimes you will notice that with certain yarns you will need it. That is different for each type of material, but well, on a sock for example there will be a lot of tension, and with a long tail you have two strands on both sides, which you don't have with a double E-wrap cast on. So it looks a bit like you have seen before. You just take a closer look at your project, and this time we are going to copy the stitch on that side. So you search for the stitch that is best to be copied, so the one that's exactly in the middle of the gap. So you follow the V shapes, and actually you are joining bottom and the top, so you look for the right stitch to copy. You adapt it to all the other stitches around it, and then you weave in the ends. And I've knitted here with 4 strands, so you can divide those strands and you weave them in apart from each other. Finishing a project or weaving ends is often the least fun of a project, but determines how the project will look. So actually it's quite an important part, and I'll show you my way, but if you have your own way of weaving ends, be my guest and use it the way you are used to. You check the other side, and if necessary you reinforce it here as well. If you don't have a strand here because of the double E-wrap cast on, you weave a new one in and you are going to copy a stitch. Okay, here's the cast on edge, and there you can only go below or above that last cast on stitch. You pull the yarn through, you have a good look again. Actually you only need 1 stitch. You put your needle below or under the next one, above it, and then you come back into your project. Go to your wrong side and you weave in the ends. And then the last one, a poncho, for example from brim to brim. Your odds and evens, that will depend on the way you did cast on this. What remains the same here is that you mark the pegs where you want to cast off. In case you are going to knit back and forth, you are also going to knit with 2 skeins. You have knitted a very large part over here, and then in the middle of the project you start casting off for the neck part. Then the yarn will also remain on one side. Unfortunately, you can't take it to the other side, so make sure you have 2 skeins from here. So when you would have knitted a poncho, you would have a panel over here, and in the middle you are going to make a neck or collar part. You can also use this for other applications. It's just like creating a very big buttonhole over here. So I divide it in 2 parts, a right and a left side. I knit with the stitch I used for the project up to the markers, and then I'm going, just like when you would have knitted in it on a round loom, I'm going to cast off the stitches the same way, like I have shown before with a traditional cast off. In this case you also look closely to what your project needs. You put the second with the first stitch, you knit over and you put it back at your project. So that will be stitch 1 again, and watch your tension, and you cast off the stitches here. So watch your tension, we don't want to have any holes or gaps around here. And you continue knitting this row. The most convenient is, when you're doing these kinds of projects, is to divide them into odd and even rows. In the even rows you do it on one side, and in the odd rows you do it on the other side, the decreases or increases, and you will see what I mean by that by watching. From here you are continuing with one skein on one side and with another skein on the other side. The second skein we are going to attach on the right side. So you start to knit in pattern again. On this side we can't cast off the stitches, so we don't knit the stitches and wait. Now you just knit actually a row with a hole in between. You attach a new strand, you knit the stitch, and here you also continue knitting your row. Next row, in the second rows and all even rows you decrease on the left side. In the odd rows you do that on the right side, and you will see that later on. At the moment that you knit that even row, then you come to the side of the casting off, and in the odd rows then you actually knit to the side from where you can cast off in the most easiest way. Keep an eye on it. You casted it on here, and here we can't go for the next piece of casting off. I don't knit the first stitch. That's to make it have a better flow over there. So you decrease one stitch on the right side and continue in pattern. Then we knit back again. This will be an even row. And then we are going to decrease over here. So take your pattern into account. And here it's actually a little bit difficult to cast off. You can cast off over there, but it won't be beautiful. So we are going to do it alternately. You don't knit your first stitch, knit your second one, you knit over, and here too you knit a decrease and you continue in pattern. And just to be sure, I will knit another row, or actually 2 rows behind it, and then you see what happens. So you continue in your stitch pattern, and in the odd rows you cast off on the left side, and in the even rows on the right side. On the right side you can't cast off as easily as you can see, but it's less beautiful. So cast off on the right side, don't knit your first stitch. This way it will be more beautiful. And then one more row with just one decrease, and then you actually are ready to cast on the stitches back again. And also on this side you don't knit your first stitch. You miss the other part of the poncho. I started to cast on a new project with a different color, but in essence it doesn't matter for the demonstration. The strands are still on the right side. I'm continuing as I just have finished, and so again you are actually continue with that subdivision. So one time it happens in the even rows, and in the next time it happens in the odd rows. But now we are increasing instead of decreasing. We're not going to cast up, but we're going to cast on the stitches. Continue knitting both sides at the same time. You start where you finished, and here you are going to add a number of stitches to create the shape of the neck. I cast on here with a double E-brab cast on because that is the most beautiful one to adjust while casting on. And as you might know, there are more techniques to increase a stitch. So you might think, I'm going to increase over here and using the technique to do a make one like shown here, but I'm not going to do it. You might get a hole over here. I'm going to knit a row now, and when it's an odd row you cast on the stitches on the right side, and when there is an even row you cast on the stitches on the left side. You were decreasing at the front part and now you are increasing at the back part, and you can still see it as knitting back and forth of a whole piece, but only now there's a gap or hole in between. Then you are going to do your next row, and now you are going to add the stitches. It's the same as the decreasing part, but you do it every time on one side, but now it's like doing it opposite. Okay, again you increase 2 stitches over here, and then you continue with this one. But here you just had increased those stitches and then you knit them. So in your odd row, next row, you go back to the left side again. At the neck part or at your neck you often have to add a little less rows, otherwise you have a deeper opening, and that's not the intention with the back part. I increase another 1 stitch, then I knit, and look at these increased stitches. They are sometimes a little bit difficult to knit over, and you knit your odd row and start again with a even row. Here I had increased 1, so then I'm going to increase another 1 on the other side as well. I continue with the other shoulder. Meanwhile I have decreased enough stitches to follow the pattern, or just do your neck the way you want it to be. And now this is the moment when you actually are going to join those 2 shoulders again. You start knitting again with 1 skein from now on. You do this from this shoulder, and you increase the number of stitches you need, so the empty packs you will do a cast on. And here you'll see that strand. I will leave it in there for a moment, and that is because you can adjust it a bit more within a few moments. What you possibly could do over here too is that you twist the 2 skeins or the 2 strands around each other. It doesn't really matter with which skein you continue knitting. And after joining them you cut 1 off. I advise to do that loom length, then you have enough to weave in. And you continue knitting in pattern. And here you come again to the part where you have joined the neck together. You pull on that 1 strand a little bit more, and here's your neck collar part, and now you have 1 whole piece, and then you continue knitting your back part. So actually in this case you need a poncho from brim to brim, so from bottom front part to bottom back part in one piece. And you continue knitting with one skein in pattern. Thanks for watching and hope to see you in another video. Bye bye, happy knitting.